She thought she was untouchable. The HOA president, Karen Whitfield, trespassed on my land, cut my fences, and unleashed chaos on my farm. All because my barn wasn't the color she liked. She sent threats, letters, flew drones over my goats, staked flags in my soil like it already belonged to her. But what she didn't know was that I used to wear a badge. And I remember exactly how to gather evidence, call in the right people, and press every charge. This isn't just a story about property lines. It's about control, about standing your ground when a powerful HOA comes for what's yours, and showing them what happens when the quiet neighbor finally says, "Enough." By the end, she ran, literally. Caught on camera, exposed in court, gone from the neighborhood she tried to rule. I didn't want a war, but she started one, and I made sure she'd never forget the man who ended it. I didn't flee to the edge of town because I despised people. I fled because for most of my adult life, I had lived inside a constant storm of sound radios spitting frantic fragments of distress sirens, howling toward moments that would scar someone forever. Voices cracked with orders, pleas, or raw grief. When I finally retired, I craved the opposite, a silence that felt safe, mornings that carried the scent of turned earth and fresh hay, instead of scorched asphalt and stale coffee. The farm was modest, 27 acres more or less stitched together from open pasture and wind-bent stands of scrub oak and hickory. A tired red barn leaned gently eastward, as if bowing to decades of weather, yet it refused to fall. The house sat well back from the road, cradled by ancient oaks, whose roots had claimed the ground long before any subdivision map or HOA covenant dared to speak for it. I bought the place with my pension and the remnants of a life insurance check after Ellen passed. It wasn't an investment in dollars. It was a line drawn in the dirt between the man I'd been and the man I hoped to become. Nothing about the land pretended to be perfect. The western fence sagged in places, patched with baling wire, and whatever posts I could salvage. The gravel driveway threw up clouds of dust if you took the curves too fast. I didn't mind the imperfections. I repaired only what threatened to fail and let the rest age with dignity. That was the quiet pact I made with the place out here. Things were allowed to wear their years honestly. For the first 12 months, the pact held. I laid out vegetable rows, brought in a small herd of goats, learned the quirks of the soil, which pockets held water after a downpour and which stayed thirsty. Passing neighbors lifted a hand in greeting. A few paused at the gate to talk weather or hay prices. Occasionally, someone mentioned the HOA down the road the way you might mention an approaching thunderhead that hadn't yet decided its path. I nodded politely and changed the subject. I already understood organizations that mistook bylaws for morality. The subdivision lay half a mile away, tidy brick homes, identical black mailboxes, lawns trimmed to the same velvet height. The HOA had been born long after my farm was surveyed, deeded, and filed with the county. My boundaries were old, unambiguous, and legally dull. I'd studied the plat maps twice before signing the paper's old habit, from a career spent proving where one person's rights ended and another's began. Knowing those lines were ironclad let me sleep soundly. Then one morning, the new signs appeared. They rose overnight, along the roadside verge like small white sentinels. Crisp green letters on glossy boards, the HOA crest, stamped proudly at the top community maintenance zone. I stood at the end of my driveway, coffee cooling in my grip, reading the words until they blurred. The nearest sign stood just outside my property line, on the narrow county easement that bordered my fence. I told myself it was harmless. HOAs adored signage. It fed their sense of dominion. I finished my coffee, turned back to the chores, and tried to shove the image aside. A week later, a dark SUV slowed as it passed. The driver wore mirrored sunglasses and a polo embroidered with the same HOA crest. He didn't wave. He simply stared long enough for me to feel it, long enough for the goats to lift their heads and stare back. When he finally accelerated, the dust lingered in the air like a warning. That was the first time the old tightness returned to my chest, the subtle coil I used to feel before stepping into a scene gone wrong. A quiet alarm that something minor was arranging itself into something larger. 2 days after that, I found the envelope in my mailbox. Thick cream stock, my full name typed, informal font. No greeting, no dear neighbor. Just a case number and the header. Notice of Community Standards Review. I didn't open it immediately. I stood in the driveway with the cicadas droning around me and the faint hum of distant traffic, feeling the paper grow warm in my hand. Part of me already knew. Another part still hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. The letter cited recent observations of property appearance concerns and potential safety hazards. It listed my fence, my barn, the non-uniform coloration of my outbuildings. It invoked standards I had never agreed to, covenants I had never signed, rules that held no jurisdiction over land-zoned agricultural decades before the first model home broke ground in Brookfield Estates. At the bottom, in neat black type, was the signature, Karen Whitfield, HOA President. I carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and read it again more slowly. The tone was impeccably polite, masterfully so. Vague enough to seem reasonable, firm enough to feel inevitable. A courteous invitation to discuss compliance, and a gentle reminder that continued non-response may necessitate further action. I exhaled a short, humorless laugh. I'd heard that cadence before in deposition rooms, in carefully worded threats disguised as procedure. That afternoon, I drafted my reply. It was brief, courteous, and precise. I attached copies of the county plat, my deed, and the relevant zoning ordinance. I stated plainly that my property lay outside HOA jurisdiction. I thanked Ms. Whitfield for her concern and requested that future correspondence respect accurate boundaries. I mailed it the same day. For weeks, nothing came back. No second letter, no drive-by, stares. I allowed myself to believe the matter had ended with facts and paperwork. I returned to the rhythm of the farm feeding at dawn, mending what weather broke, watching peach buds swell along the southern fence line. Then one cool morning I found the footprints. They tracked along the inside of my western fence, deep boot treads pressed into the soft earth after a night rain. Not animal, human. The stride was deliberate, pausing every dozen steps as if to study something. I followed the prints with my eyes until they vanished toward the road, the same road that curved straight into Brookfield Estates. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to wind slide through the oaks. Common sense said people walked county easements all the time. But the spacing of those prints, the careful placement, whispered a different story. I went inside, pulled my survey maps from the file drawer, and spread them across the table. The boundary lines stared back at me, straight, measured, unambiguous. That morning was the last truly quiet one. I would know for a long while. After that, the farm no longer felt invisible. It felt observed. And once an entity like an HOA fixes its gaze on you, silence stops being peace. It becomes the held breath before the next move. Spring arrived early that year, loosening the frost from the soil by late February. By March, the peach trees I'd planted along the southern fence were swelling with pale pink buds, promising fruit if the late freezes held off. I had just finished spreading a thick layer of compost across the lower field when I spotted the second envelope. This one hadn't come through the mail. It had been slid beneath my front door while I was out. That detail stopped me cold. The mailbox sat a quarter-mile down at the road. No delivery driver, no neighbor, no solicitor ever bothered to navigate the rutted driveway uninvited. The path was deliberately unwelcoming, deep potholes, sharp gravel, a silent warning that said, "Turn around unless you belong here." I stood on the threshold in manure-caked boots, staring at the crisp white rectangle against the worn floorboards, my full name again printed in the same severe serif font. No postage, no return address, only the faint embossed HOA seal on the flap. Inside was a letter far less courteous than the first. It no longer hinted, it accused. The barn's peeling red paint was now labeled a visual disruption to community cohesion. My goats had become a sanitation concern. Worst of all, my sheds and livestock shelters were suddenly unauthorized auxiliary structures that might contravene current HOA standards. I read it 3 times, heat rising along my neck. Between the lines pulsed a single arrogant claim that proximity to their manicured kingdom somehow granted them dominion over my land. That because my farm shared a horizon with their identical rooftops, I owed them conformity. I carried the letter outside and stood in front of the barn, studying its weathered panels in the late morning light. The paint had blistered and faded, yes, but the timbers beneath were solid oak, hand-hewn by someone a century before Karen Whitfield was born. This building had sheltered livestock, through blizzards, floods, and droughts. It worked. It belonged. It did not exist to flatter a committee's aesthetic whims. I checked the stalls, the latches, the roofline, everything sound. Then I stepped back out into the yard. The air felt suddenly still, as though the breeze itself had paused to listen. And that was when I saw her for the first time. A woman stood just inside my fence line, half concealed by a stand of blooming dogwoods. Tall early 50s posture, rigid as a flagpole. Oversized sunglasses hid her eyes, a salmon pink blazer screamed authority, and in her right hand, she held a tablet recording. She did not startle when my boots crunched on the gravel. She lifted her chin instead as if daring me to speak first. "You're on my property," I called, voice steady. "I'm within the public easement," she answered without lowering the device. I had walked that boundary hundreds of times. I knew every post, every sag in the wire. She stood 3 full strides inside my field, between the fresh furrows I'd plowed only days before. "No, ma'am, you're not." Her mouth twitched almost a smile. Then she pivoted smoothly, walked back toward the road, and disappeared around the curve without another word. That evening, I phoned the sheriff's office and filed an informal report. Deputy Jeffrey took the call. He'd known me since I moved in, recognized my voice before I gave my name. "Karen again," he asked, weariness already in his tone. "Looks like it." He exhaled. "You're not the first to complain. She's got a reputation for testing fences, literal and otherwise. Anyone ever press charges?" "Not yet," he said. "But she keeps pushing someone will." I thanked him, hung up, and ordered 2 more trail cameras the same night. The following week, she returned, this time with reinforcements. 2 men in matching navy windbreakers lingered at my eastern boundary, one rolling a measuring wheel, the other scribbling on a clipboard. Karen followed a step behind, issuing clipped instructions I couldn't quite hear. I approached, calmly, phone already recording. "This is private property," I said clearly. "You have no authority here." The man with the clipboard muttered something about a compliance assessment. His partner avoided my eyes entirely. Karen stepped forward, smile thin, and practiced. "We're documenting violations that affect neighborhood valuation." I kept the lens steady. "This isn't your neighborhood." Her smile held, but something flickered behind the sunglasses. "The association is exploring expansion options. Petitions are circulating. You were notified." I couldn't help it. I laughed, a short bark that scattered the goats behind me. "A petition doesn't grant you permission to walk my land. This isn't a monarchy." She said nothing, only tilted her head a fraction, as though memorizing my face for later. That night, I emailed the video to Russell Berman, my attorney, a semi-retired bulldog, who despised bureaucratic overreach the way sailors despise calm seas. The next morning, certified mail brought the 3rd letter. This one carried the weight of an ultimatum: remove all non-compliant structures within 30 days or face enforcement proceedings. It quoted HOA covenants like scripture, hoping, I suppose, that the sheer volume of legalese would make me flinch. But 25 years of reading threats, some idle, some lethal, had taught me how to separate bluster from bite. I printed the latest county zoning map, highlighted my parcel in yellow, and circled the word agricultural in red. I called the recorder's office and spoke to Miles, the same clerk who'd helped me before closing. "Your land's outside their bounds," he confirmed, voice flat with repetition. "They can't force annexation without every affected owner's consent. Unanimous. State law. So this is just noise. Expensive noise," he said, "but noise all the same." That afternoon, I installed new signs every 50 feet along the perimeter, bold, black letters on white aluminum: private property. No trespassing, video surveillance. I mounted the camera's high and visible red lights blinking like watchful eyes. For a handful of days, the road stayed quiet. No slow-moving SUVs. No distant flashes of salmon pink. The wind returned, the goats grazed undisturbed, and I let myself believe the message had landed. But deep in my gut, I felt the shift the way the air thickens before a summer storm. This wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And whatever came next would come with sharper teeth. The fragile calm lasted only a few days, long enough for the new signs to fade slightly in the sun, and for the red lights on the cameras to become familiar sentinels. Then Karen's games took a more theatrical turn. It began with the dog, a small snow-white fluff ball that yapped more than it walked, clearly chosen more for accessory than companionship. Every morning at exactly 7:20, Karen appeared on the shoulder of the county road designer leash in one hand, oversized coffee cup in the other. I noticed because that was the hour I stepped outside to gauge the sky and plan the day's work. Her timing disrupted the quiet ritual I'd come to cherish. At first, she stayed on the public gravel sunglasses firmly in place. Even on cloudy days, the dog tugged and barked at every rustle in the grass. I ignored her. But soon the routine shifted. She began pausing directly opposite my gate, standing motionless for minutes at a time, staring across the fence as though inventorying my every flaw. Some mornings, I offered a neighborly wave. She responded by raising her phone, pretending to check messages, while the lens pointed unmistakably toward the barn. Other times, she swept the camera slowly across the pasture, capturing the goats, the sheds, the peeling paint she despised so much. It didn't matter if I was hauling feed buckets or repairing a trough, she recorded it all as if waiting for me to slip into some damning act. It wasn't long before the walks crept closer. She started using the narrow maintenance path that ran parallel to my western tree line, an old county easement, overgrown and unused for years. Technically public, but forgotten by everyone except her. She would linger there crouching to adjust a shoelace, while angling her phone beneath the lower wire for clearer shots of the water tank or compost piles. One humid dawn, I caught her red-handed. She was crouched, low arm extended through the fence phone, held out like a periscope. I approached quietly and cleared my throat. She jumped so violently the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. "This is private land," I said, keeping my tone level. She rose slowly, brushing non-existent dust from her immaculate slacks, and offered a condescending smirk. "You ought to be grateful," she replied. "Someone has to safeguard the aesthetic integrity of the area. You wouldn't want to drag down everyone else's property values, would you? This isn't your area." Her eyes narrowed behind the dark lenses. Not yet. She turned and strolled away, as though the conversation had been her idea all along. That same afternoon, I called Deputy Jeffrey again. He arrived within the hour, boots crunching down the driveway like an old friend. We walked the fence together, following the fresh scuff marks and heel prints pressed into the damp soil where she'd leaned against the posts. "She's getting bolder," he muttered, crouching to examine a particularly deep impression. "Bold's generous," I said. "Reckless is closer." He straightened. "I can have a word with her. She'll deny everything." He nodded, knowing it was true. "Ever consider a civil no-contact order?" "I've thought about it, but I'd rather let her keep digging her own hole." Jeffrey gave me a long look that carried years of shared understanding. "Just keep documenting. The second she crosses again, call me right away." So I did. I upgraded the camera system, motion-triggered floodlights, high-resolution lenses, even license plate capture on the rear approach. Every photo, every time-stamped clip of her lurking at the edge of my world went into a dedicated folder. Then came the day she brought an audience. 4 figures appeared on the easement path, Karen in front, 3 HOA board members trailing behind like dutiful courtiers. They carried clipboards and spoke in hushed, self-important tones. One man aimed a laser distance measurer through the fence slats, as if already planning how my barn might look with vinyl siding. I crossed the field without hurry, phone recording. "Morning," I said loudly. "You're all on notice, this is private property." Karen's smile was immediate and brittle. "We're conducting a routine perimeter review. Updated boundary maps will be forwarded shortly." "Unless you're licensed surveyors contracted by the county," I replied. "You're just civilians committing trespass." The man with the laser shifted uncomfortably. One of the women glanced nervously toward the road. Karen's chin lifted. "You can't keep resisting progress indefinitely." "Progress," I echoed. "Is that what you call ignoring property lines?" The word hung between us like a challenge. To her, progress meant erasure of weathering, of independence, of anything that refused to match her vision of tidy sameness. My farm, with its honest scars and living chaos, offended her sense of order the way a thorn offends silk. A few days later, a glossy flyer appeared duct-taped to my mailbox, Community Beautification Forum. All adjacent property owners encouraged to attend. Adjacent. The word again, like a leash, slipped around my neck. I went. Not to negotiate or appease, but to look her in the eye, in front of witnesses. The clubhouse smelled of artificial lemon cleaner and new carpet. Rows of folding chairs faced a projector screen. I was the only person in work boots and faded flannel. Everyone else looked freshly pressed from offices or gyms. Karen stood at the podium in a navy suit, slideshow cued and ready. Her presentation was flawless theater. Charts of rising property values, Stock photos of manicured streetscapes, bullet points about cohesive visual identity, and preventative aesthetic standards. She spoke of harmony, investment protection, and the burdens of nonconformity. Then she clicked to a slide showing my barn photographed, without permission, the red paint exaggerated in harsh light, and asked the room, "Is this level of visual discord truly fair to the broader community?" A murmur rippled through the seats. I raised my hand. Heads turned. Karen's smile faltered for half a heartbeat. "Yes, Mr. Walker," she said, as though my name tasted unpleasant. "Do you possess any legal instrument granting Brookfield Estates authority over my parcel?" She recovered quickly. "We are actively reviewing jurisdictional parameters." Translation: no. A few nervous laughs escaped. "We are pursuing formal annexation channels," she pressed, "which require unanimous consent of affected landowners under county statute," I said. "Have you secured mine?" Silence spread like spilled ink. Karen's cheeks colored faintly. Cooperation would benefit everyone. And respect for existing law would benefit me, I answered. "You don't get to redraw ownership by majority vote." The room shifted uncomfortably. The Q&A ended there. I left before the closing remarks, stepping into the cooling evening air. The subdivision stretched before me in perfect rows. Houses like soldiers at attention lawns, shaved to identical height, every porch light glowing the same sterile white. I understood then what truly frightened her. My farm reminded her that control has limits. Behind me through the glass doors, her voice rose in clipped frustration. I didn't turn back. Let her rage. Out here, her rules were only words. And words without law behind them are just wind. I should have known the humiliation at the clubhouse would only sharpen her resolve. People like Karen don't retreat when embarrassed. They regroup, recalibrate, and come back wearing a different mask. The first new tactic arrived not from her, but from the county clerk's office. It was a Tuesday morning, the air still cool and sweet with dew. I was wrestling blackberry brambles along the northern boundary when my phone rang. Miles again, the same weary voice from the recorder's office. "Mr. Walker, hate to bother you, but there's been a public records request. Brookfield Estates just filed paperwork to open an annexation feasibility study. Your parcel is shaded inside their proposed expansion area." The pruning shears slipped from my hand. "They're trying to, what?" "They can't force it," Miles said quickly. "Not without a public hearing and unanimous consent from every affected owner. But they're planting flags figuratively for now." I thanked him, requested copies of everything, and promised my attorney would follow up. Before he hung up, Miles added quietly, "You're not the only one they've circled. You're just the first to stand up." That evening, I spread every historical document I owned across the kitchen table. The original 1947 land grant, every plat revision zoning overlays, going back 70 years. I overlaid their new sketch with translucent paper and a red grease pencil. Their lines were brazen. 5 additional parcels swallowed whole mine. The largest, the only one still classified agricultural, the only one without sewer hookup, the only one that refused to conform. The very next morning, I found the literal flags. Pink surveyor ribbons fluttered along a perfect rectangle, staked straight through my best pasture. 14 bright markers spaced precisely, carving out a chunk of my land as casually as slicing pie. No phone call, no notice, no permission. Just fiberglass rods stamped with the Brookfield Estates logo. I knelt beside the nearest one, fingers brushing the cheap plastic sticker. My pulse thrummed in my ears. I photographed every flag from multiple angles, logged GPS coordinates, and emailed the album to Deputy Jeffrey with a subject line that needed no elaboration: illegal survey markers on private property. Then I called Russell Berman. He growled the moment he saw the images. "They've gone completely off the rails. They're testing how far they can push before someone pushes back hard enough to hurt." Well, Russell said, lesson time. Within hours, he drafted a cease and desist letter addressed personally to Karen Whitfield. It cited trespass, unauthorized survey activity, and intentional interference with private property rights. Copies of the deed zoning records and a stern warning of impending legal action were attached. We sent it certified, emailed, and hand-delivered by process server. 3 days of silence followed. No flags were moved, but no new ones either. No slow cruises past the gate. I began to hope the message had finally sunk in. Then came the drone. Late afternoon golden light slanting across the barn. I was tossing hay to the goats when the buzz reached me, high insect-like, persistent. I looked up and saw it matte black four rotors camera, gimbal swaying as it hovered directly above the livestock shelter. It didn't wander. It mapped circling the barn, the tractor shed, the greenhouse frames I'd just erected, cataloging evidence. Old instincts flared. I stepped inside, grabbed my binoculars, and tracked its flight path. Definitely not a kid's toy. Professional grade. I filed an FAA low-altitude violation report that same day. Proximity to livestock and farm equipment gave me solid grounds. The agent I spoke with confirmed that non-recreational flights below 400 feet over private property required explicit permission. Another mark against her ledger. Yet the pressure didn't ease. A new letter arrived, this one wrapped in saccharine politeness, an invitation to a community harmonization dialogue. It painted annexation as a generous gift, a chance for me to align standards for mutual prosperity. I didn't dignify it with a reply. Instead, I printed every complaint, every cease and desist, every FAA and sheriff report, and paid a visit to Darnell Avery at the county planning office. Darnell and I had hauled supplies together in a desert a lifetime ago. He still owed me. When I laid out the timeline, he whistled low. She's been busy. Utility map requests, encroachment studies, your name's on half the paperwork. I want it shut down. He leaned back, fingers steepled. Then speak at the next zoning board meeting. Public record. On the docket. Testimony with evidence can freeze their expansion cold. Date. Thursday next week. Put me down. On my way out, I paused at a corkboard in the hallway. Tacked among the notices was a faded flyer from the land auction where I'd first seen this farm, listed my own red circle still visible around the parcel number. The land had outlasted owners' recessions, redrawn county lines. It had never bowed to petty tyranny dressed as governance. Not until Karen. Back home, I sat on the porch as dusk settled, listening for the drone that didn't come. The quiet felt temporary, like the hush inside a courtroom just before verdict. She was scheming again. I could almost feel the calculations spinning behind those sunglasses. What she couldn't or wouldn't grasp was that the soil under my nails carried more than crops. It carried memory, and I would not let her erase it. The zoning board meeting took place in a low beige municipal building that smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I walked in, boots echoing on the linoleum. The room was half full, mostly locals there for routine matters like drainage complaints or sign permits, but a cluster of familiar faces from Brookfield Estates sat near the front, notebooks, open postures, alert. Karen was already there. She stood at the podium in a crisp navy blazer HOA pin, gleaming like a badge of office. A thick folder rested beside her projector. When our eyes met, she offered a small professional nod, the kind politicians exchange before a debate. I returned it with nothing. Took a seat in the center aisle and laid my own folder on my lap. Plat maps, drone photos, cease and desist letters, FAA complaint, confirmation, and the original deed signed by my grandfather when the ink was still wet. The chair called new business. Karen went first. Her presentation was sleek, almost seductive. Slides of rising property values, renderings of enhanced community corridors. Phrases like visual consistency buffer and proactive blight mitigation. She spoke of growth harmony and shared prosperity. Then she clicked to a full-screen image of my barn rust, bleeding through faded red, taken from an angle that made it look derelict, and let the silence linger. These adjacent properties, she said smoothly, possess tremendous potential, yet currently present challenges to community harmony if left unregulated. The word unregulated landed like a gavel in my mind. She closed with an appeal for visionary governance and a more beautiful tomorrow. Polite applause rippled through her supporters. The chair scanned the room. Any public comment? I stood. The air seemed to thicken. My name is Nathan Walker, owner of parcel 14-310-6B. The farm Brookfield Estates is attempting to annex without consent or legal standing. I faced the board directly. This land was deeded 64 years before the first shovel broke ground in Brookfield Estates. It is zoned agricultural by the county and has never been encumbered by any HOA covenant. I have never signed a declaration, never paid dues, never agreed to jurisdiction. I held up the current county plat. This is the official record. My parcel is not shaded within their boundaries. I flipped to their submission. This is their filing where they have arbitrarily redrawn lines to include my property and 4 others despite state law requiring unanimous landowner consent for involuntary annexation. Karen's posture stiffened. I continued. Since receiving their unsolicited notices, I have documented repeated unauthorized entries, survey flags planted without permission, drone surveillance over my livestock photographs taken and distributed without consent, and multiple instances of physical trespass. I placed the stack of evidence on the dais, sheriff reports, time-stamped videos, the FAA violation filing. This is not about aesthetics, I said, turning to look at Karen. This is about control, and I will not surrender what is legally, historically, and morally mine. The room held its breath. Darnell Avery rose from the second row. As county zoning liaison, I confirm, Mr. Walker's parcel lies outside existing HOA jurisdiction and cannot be annexed without his explicit agreement. Any unpermitted activity on his land constitutes trespass and is actionable. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The chair adjusted his glasses. Thank you both. Documentation will be entered. The board will issue a formal denial of the annexation request pertaining to parcel 14-306B within 7 days. A quiet bang of the gavel. Karen gathered her materials with clipped efficiency, muttered something under her breath as she passed me, "This isn't over," and exited through the side door. I replied softly, "No, but now it's permanent record." Outside, night air wrapped cool around me. The stars burned clear and indifferent overhead. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt lighter. But experience had taught me that public defeat only drives certain personalities deeper into the shadows. 2 nights later, I learned how deep. I woke to frantic goat bleating and the eerie creak of metal on metal. Moonlight silvered the yard as I pulled on boots and grabbed a flashlight. The west gate, the one I locked every evening, hung wide open, one hinge groaning in the breeze. I ran. Goats scattered along the roadside, eyes glowing in my beam. A young kid had tangled itself in loose wire. Another nosed curiously at the ditch. Fresh boot prints led from the road through the cut fence and back out again, deep, deliberate impressions in the soft earth. Someone had sliced the tension wire cleanly with heavy cutters, unlatched the gate, and tampered with my cameras. The unit facing that corner had been rotated just enough to blind it. But they hadn't noticed the backup lens I'd mounted high behind the hay silo. That camera caught everything. Karen hood up, dark clothing, unmistakable posture, ducking through the breach, snipping wire, swinging the gate wide. She paused once, glanced toward the house, then retreated the way she came. The footage was crystal clear. Rage settled over me, cold and precise. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was sabotage. I called Deputy Jeffrey at dawn. "I want a criminal report filed," I told him. "Trespass with intent, property damage, livestock endangerment. You have video." "Every second. We'll be there within the hour. Do not engage." As the sky paled, I stood on the porch and watched the horizon where her subdivision lay hidden beyond the trees. She had finally crossed a line there was no walking back from. And this time the law would do the walking for me. The deputies arrived just after sunrise, 2 patrol cruisers easing down the gravel like they belonged there. Dust still hung in the air from Karen's midnight visit, and the cut fence wire glinted accusingly in the early light. I met them at the gate with a tablet in one hand and fresh coffee in the other. Deputy Jeffrey stepped out first, squinting at the damage before turning to me. "Morning, Nate. You said you've got clear video." "Better than clear," I replied, tapping the screen to cue the clip. Night vision, full color, time-stamped. She's wearing dark clothes and a hood, but the way she moves, you'll know it's her. We watched together. Karen's silhouette slipped through the breach she'd just cut, swung the gate wide, adjusted the misaligned camera with deliberate care, then vanished back toward the road. The footage was undeniable. Jeffrey shook his head slowly. She really thought she'd outsmart the system. The younger deputy photographed the boot prints, the severed wire, the scattered goats now nervously huddled near the barn. I walked them through the estimated repair costs, new tension wire 3 replacement panels, veterinary check for the kid that had tangled itself. "You want to press charges?" Jeffrey asked, pen poised. I looked across the pasture where the morning mist still clung to the grass. The goats were safe, but the violation lingered like a bruise. "Yes," I said. "Criminal trespass, vandalism, and anything else the DA thinks will stick." They logged. Everything, took digital copies of the files, and left with a promise to forward the case immediately. By noon, her silver SUV crawled past the end of my driveway. She didn't stop, didn't wave, but she slowed just enough for our eyes to lock across the distance. I stood on the porch, arms folded, and held her gaze until she accelerated away. 2 hours later, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Subject: urgent matter. HOA legal representation. Attached was a cease and desist letter from the association's attorney. It accused me of defamation, targeted harassment of HOA leadership, and malicious manipulation of surveillance footage to undermine community trust. It demanded I remove all cameras pointing toward public rights-of-way and cease inflammatory contact with law enforcement. Not one word acknowledging the fence. Not one denial of the video. Just the panicked thrashing of someone who knew the ground was shifting beneath her. I forwarded it to Russell with a single line: "They're scared. Time to turn up the heat." He called back laughing, a rare gravelly sound. "This is retaliation in neon lights. They just handed us a gift." That afternoon, he fired back a counter letter: every claim categorically denied, every action justified under state law for property security, and a warning that further baseless threats would trigger counterclaims for damages, abuse of process, and emotional distress. Copies went to the sheriff, the zoning board, and Karen personally. Then, because silence is sometimes the loudest answer, we uploaded the fence-cutting footage to the county's Neighborhood Watch forum. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, the clip had thousands of views. Comments ranged from stunned disbelief to outright fury. Other property owners, some inside Brookfield Estates, some adjacent like me, began messaging privately. Stories of intimidation letters, surprise inspections, threats over paint colors or garden beds. I wasn't the only one she'd bullied. She'd just been the quietest. The next morning, I found her waiting at the foot of my driveway. She stood on the public shoulder arms, crossed sunglasses firmly in place, despite the overcast sky. Not on my land technically, but close enough to force a confrontation. I didn't walk out to meet her. I simply opened the front door and waited on the porch. She broke first. "You're making a terrible mistake," she called, voice carrying across the yard. I raised an eyebrow. "You think this makes you a hero? You're just a stubborn old man clinging to dirt." "This dirt has my name on the deed," I answered. "Yours doesn't." Her lips thinned. "You think the sheriff's office will protect you forever? I have resources. I have influence." "You have a criminal complaint with your face on video," I said, "and a warrant in process." The color drained from her cheeks. "You're lying. Check with your attorney. I'm sure he'll be calling you soon." She stared a moment longer, nostrils flaring, then spun on her heel, climbed into the SUV, and sped off fast enough to spray gravel against my mailbox. By evening, I'd added reinforced padlocks to every gate, reviewed the overnight footage twice, and received confirmation from Jeffrey the case had been forwarded to the district attorney. Formal charges were being prepared. Karen had graduated from nuisance to suspect. I could see the fear in her now, not of me, but of exposure, of consequences, finally catching up to entitlement. The line she'd crossed that night wasn't just wire and wood. It was the law itself. And the law, patient as sunrise, was coming for her. The investigation gained momentum faster than I expected. 2 days after the fence incident, a county investigator accompanied the deputies to re-examine the site. They found a rusted survey flag, half buried near the cut wire, one of the pink markers from Karen's earlier boundary sweep. It tied her physically to multiple violations long after the cease and desist had been served. Jeffrey crouched beside it, snapping photos. "This just keeps getting better for you." "Better isn't the word I'd choose," I said, "but necessary." He stood dusting dirt from his knees. "DA's reviewing everything now. Pattern of behavior, clear intent." With the video evidence, this could move to felony territory if they find financial misuse tied to the drone or surveys. I nodded, letting that settle. Boundaries weren't abstract to me. They were the difference between order and chaos, between safety and threat. If you let someone trample yours without consequence, the world learned it could take whatever it wanted. 3 days later, she came back in broad daylight. I was seeding sunflower rows in the south field, sun hot on my neck, when gravel crunched behind me. Her silver SUV rolled slowly down the rear access trail, the same forgotten easement she'd exploited before. My stomach tightened. A temporary no-contact order had been issued after the fence sabotage. She'd been served personally. I had the signed return of service in my files. Yet here she was, parking just outside the gate, stepping onto my pasture, as if the paper meant nothing. Tablet in hand, she began filming slow pans across the compost bins, the goat pens, the new greenhouse frames. The animals shifted uneasily, sensing the intrusion. I dropped the seed bag and strode toward her. "Leave now," I called, voice carrying clear across the open ground. She didn't turn. Karen. That got her. She glanced over her shoulder, and for an instant, I saw the miscalculation flash across her face. She'd been caught again. Then composure snapped back into place. "I'm documenting potential code violations from a public vantage," she said coolly. "For legal review. You're inside my fence. You're violating a court order, and I'm recording every second." I held up my phone. The red dot glowed. Her eyes flicked to the gate, calculating distance. Then, to my astonishment, she broke into a brisk jog, not panicked, but urgent, toward her vehicle. Keys fumbled, door slammed. Engine roared as she reversed in a spray of gravel and sped away without looking back. I stood there until the dust settled, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity. I called Jeffrey immediately. She was inside the pasture again, filming. Ignored 2 direct commands to leave. Video. Start to finish, including her running to the car. He exhaled sharply. "That's a direct violation of the protective order. We're issuing a citation today and escalating to the DA. This could jump straight to misdemeanor or worse." An officer arrived that afternoon to collect the new footage. We reviewed the entire library together, or timestamps, aligned, incidents, chained into an unmistakable pattern. But I wasn't waiting for the system alone anymore. Russell filed a motion for a formal perimeter protection order, rare, but precedent existed for properties under sustained harassment. It would codify the HOA's lack of jurisdiction and place my land under permanent, non-annexable status pending a full hearing. In the interim, it froze every expansion attempt cold. Karen's carefully laid empire stalled on paper. Her desperation began leaking through the cracks. The next morning, an anonymous text buzzed on my phone. "You think you're righteous, but you're a danger to the neighborhood. Back off while you still can." No name, but the phrasing carried her signature arrogance. I forwarded it to the sheriff with a note likely from the subject of the active investigation. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Not from fear I'd faced worse in darker places, but from the knowledge of how cornered people behave when their usual weapons fail. They lash out. Just past midnight, motion alerts lit my phone. The driveway camera showed a dark sedan rolling slowly past, headlights off. It didn't stop, didn't turn in. Just crept by, paused long enough to match the timing of the threatening text, then vanished down the road. I stepped onto the porch in the chill flashlight in one hand, my old .38 revolver holstered at my side. I didn't draw it. I simply stood in the moonlight, visible, unmoving, letting whoever watched know the farm was still occupied, still defended. The next morning, Russell called, voice edged with satisfaction. "Hearing's been scheduled for Thursday. Full county board. Karen's been subpoenaed as a witness." I stared out at the pasture where the goats grazed peacefully in the rising light. The ground felt steadier beneath me, but I knew the deepest fracture was still widening. And on Thursday, it would finally break open in public. Thursday arrived with a dry, restless heat that made the air shimmer above the gravel roads. I ironed my best shirt, the one I saved for funerals and court dates, pressed the collar flat, and drove the old Ford into town. The county administration building rose plain and unassuming against the sky, 2 stories of weathered brick that had heard every kind of grievance this land could produce. Today it would hear mine and hers. The hearing room was smaller than I remembered, a long table at the front, for the 5 board members, rows of wooden chairs behind. A dozen spectators scattered across the seats, some curious neighbors, a reporter from the local weekly Darnell Avery in the second row. Karen arrived, late, heels clicking sharply as she pushed through the doors. Navy suit, buttoned high binder, clutched like armor, sunglasses still perched on her head indoors. She avoided my eyes, but I felt the glance graze me anyway. We were called forward together. Nathaniel Walker petitioned for permanent boundary protection and injunction against Brookfield Estates HOA expansion. I stepped to the podium first, paper steady in my hands, phone recording discreetly in my pocket. I didn't shout, I didn't need to. I laid out the timeline like evidence at a crime scene, dates of every letter, every unauthorized entry, every threat. I handed over the sheriff's reports, the FAA violation, the drone vendor invoices that had surfaced during discovery. Then I played the videos, slow, undeniable sequences of Karen planting flags, flying surveillance overhead, cutting my fence in the dead of night, and finally sprinting back to her vehicle after violating the no-contact order. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room when her hooded figure appeared on the screen snipping wire. Someone behind me whispered, "That's actually illegal." I kept my voice even. This property has been in my family longer than Brookfield Estates has existed. It is zoned agricultural, free of any covenant or encumbrance. I have never consented to HOA oversight, and I never will. Yet the association under Ms. Whitfield's direction has engaged in sustained harassment, trespass vandalism, and intimidation in an attempt to seize control of land they have no claim to. I turned to face her directly. This isn't about peeling paint or goat manure. It's about whether one person's obsession with conformity can override law history and basic decency. I sat. Karen rose heels striking the floor like punctuation. She began smoothly, voice modulated for sympathy. Honorable board members, Mr. Walker has presented a selective narrative. Yes, his property lies adjacent to our community, and yes, it exhibits certain irregularities, deteriorating structures, uncontrolled livestock, open composting that poses potential environmental risks. She opened her binder and displayed enlarged photos my barn again, the compost piles a close-up of rust on a gate hinge. All taken without permission. Our intention has always been protective of health standards, of property values, of aesthetic cohesion for all residents. She paused, offering the room a practiced smile. As for the trespass allegations, any brief incursion onto Mr. Walker's land during documentation was inadvertent and in service of community welfare. The chair leaned forward. Ms. Whitfield, do you deny entering the fenced pasture on the dates shown in the video evidence? A beat of hesitation just long enough. I may have momentarily crossed a boundary line while gathering visual data, she admitted. But context matters. My actions were never malicious. And the drone surveillance, conducted by a licensed vendor under HOA contract for assessment purposes, without landowner consent or FAA clearance over livestock. Another pause. The vendor assumed responsibility for regulatory compliance. The questions kept coming calm but relentless. Each answer exposed another crack. She deflected, minimized, reframed, but the footage didn't lie, and neither did the paper trail. After 30 minutes of deliberation, behind closed doors, the board returned. The chair cleared his throat. Based on the evidence and testimony presented, this board finds that Brookfield Estates HOA possesses no jurisdictional authority over parcel 14 to 310, 6B. We hereby grant permanent exclusionary status, prohibiting any future annexation attempt without explicit landowner consent and full county oversight. All related civil and criminal matters are referred to the district attorney for continued investigation. The gavel fell once sharp final. Karen's face drained of color. She gathered her binder with stiff mechanical movements and left through the side door without a word. I stayed long enough to shake Darnell's hand. You held the line, he said quietly. Wasn't just my line, I replied. Outside the heat pressed down, but the air tasted cleaner. Shoulders I hadn't realized were knotted began to loosen. Yet a remaining ember glowed low in my chest, not triumph, but the knowledge that wounded pride can bite hardest on its way down. Karen wasn't finished, but the law had finally spoken louder than she ever could. And for the first time in months, the farm felt truly mine again. The board's ruling should have felt like the final chord of a long, discordant song, but instead it echoed like a warning shot. Karen didn't vanish quietly into defeat. For a few days, her SUV stopped patrolling the road, her name disappeared from the HOA website, and the neighborhood Facebook group locked itself down, posts, hidden comments, disabled moderators suddenly on hiatus. The silence felt brittle, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. Then the call came. Russell rang just after lunch, amusement threading his gravelly voice. She's hired counsel, high-dollar firm out of the city. I leaned against the porch rail watching dust devils dance across the dry pasture. Expected. She's filed a preemptive civil suit, emotional distress, harassment, reputational harm. Claims you orchestrated a campaign to destroy her standing. A short, dry laugh escaped me. After everything on record, she's betting on public sympathy. Paint you as the cranky recluse terrorizing a well-meaning volunteer. But the DA just requested your full surveillance archive. Charges are being formalized. Criminal charges: multiple counts, criminal trespass, vandalism, violation of the protective order, misuse of HOA funds for the drone contractor. They're also pulling flight logs. Turns out her vendor ignored FAA livestock protocols. I let the weight of it settle. Does she know yet? Served Monday morning. But Karen never waited for Monday. Friday evening, as the sun bled orange across the barn roof and long shadows stretched over the fields, I stood near the mended fence line with a mug of coffee gone cold. A sheriff's cruiser turned onto the gravel road, moving at a deliberate pace, no lights, no siren, just the quiet authority of inevitability. 2 deputies emerged. Jeffrey was one of them. I walked down to meet them. "She home?" I asked. Jeffrey nodded toward the subdivision. "We served the papers 20 minutes ago." "How'd she take it?" He hesitated. "Poorly. Tried to bolt." "Bolt." Second deputy spoke up, voice calm. "Jumped in her SUV, attempted to leave the scene. Ignored verbal commands. Nearly sideswiped a neighbor's mailbox, swinging around the cul-de-sac. She ran." "Not far," Jeffrey said. "We blocked the exit." Anonymous tip from one of her own board members: she was shredding documents in the clubhouse. "Now there's a separate obstruction probe." He handed me a folded printout, the charging document. Karen Lynn Whitfield, criminal trespass misdemeanor, pending vandalism, harassment, violation of protective order. Her signature at the bottom was jagged, frantic. What's next? Arraignment early next week. Judge will almost certainly impose a full restraining order. County auditors already requesting HOA financials if they find diverted funds for surveillance. "She's finished," I said. Jeffrey met my eyes. "Not because you hunted her. Because she thought rules were for other people." They left as quietly as they'd come. I walked the perimeter once more, in the failing light. The repaired gate stood solid, new steel braces gleaming. No pink flags fluttered, no boot prints marred the soil. The farm breathed easy again. Later that night, neighbors I barely knew began reaching out. Gary Duncan, the man from Fox Ridge Court, who'd once feared speaking up, showed up at my gate with a 6-pack and a quiet apology. I voted for her, he admitted, staring at his boots. Thought she kept things nice. Didn't see the cost until you paid it. Others followed in the days after, emails, texts. A casserole left on the porch with a note that simply read, "Thank you." People who'd lived under the same shadow suddenly found their voices. The HOA fractured overnight. Half the board resigned. An emergency meeting elected interim leadership. Rumors swirled of a full audit, possible dissolution. Karen's house went dark. Word spread that she'd loaded a U-Haul under cover of night and left the state no goodbyes, no forwarding address. Just gone like a storm that finally spent itself. The local paper splashed it across the front page. HOA president resigns. Amid charges, audit looms. And just like that, the pressure lifted. Neighbors waved again when they passed. One woman brought her daughter to feed carrots to the goats through the fence. Another offered help staining the barn my choice of color, no judgment. I didn't ask for gratitude. I'd only wanted what was mine, the right to let my barn fade honestly, to keep my gates my own, to live without permission from a committee. But something unexpected grew in the quiet that followed. People began to remember they could say no. They could paint a door blue, plant wildflowers. Instead of sod, leave a shed unpainted if it suited them. Sometimes holding one boundary steady gives others courage to hold theirs. 3 weeks later, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, only the typed header of the interim HOA committee. A single page. Effective immediately, Karen Whitfield has resigned as president of Brookfield Estates HOA. An interim board has been seated pending audit and member vote. We acknowledge past disputes involving your property and confirm that no further correspondence or action regarding your land will originate from this association. Respectfully, Interim Chair. No apology, no restitution, but also no more letters, no more threats, no more Karen. The storm had passed, and in its wake the air felt wider, the sky higher, the dirt beneath my boots more firmly my own. At the final zoning session, when the board ratified the permanent non-annexation order and sealed it with an official stamp, I was offered a closing statement for the record. I stood, cleared my throat, and spoke the words I'd carried for months. When someone tries to claim your land with nothing but letters and threats, it's never really about paint colors or fence heights. It's about whether one person's need for control can outweigh another's right to exist in peace. But when you meet those threats with evidence, with law, And with quiet resolve, they falter. They run. And you remain. Because this ground doesn't just belong to me, I belong to it. The room stayed silent when I finished. No applause, no murmurs. Just the weight of something settled. I returned to the farm and slipped back into the life I'd carved, one post, one row, one season at a time. I rebuilt the gate's stronger steel braces welded clean heavy padlocks that clicked with finality. I repainted the barn not because anyone demanded it, but because I wanted to see fresh color against the sky. I chose a deeper defiant red that caught the morning light like a banner. I still review the camera feeds each night not from paranoia, but from the calm knowledge that vigilance is the price of freedom. I still carry my phone during chores, but now it's more for photographing new peach blossoms than for recording intruders. The goats have settled into an easier rhythm, their bells softer in the evenings. The soil drinks the rain better since I rotated the fields. I even framed in a small greenhouse along the southern slope glass panes catching sunlight for winter greens, a quiet act of forward motion. People still ask half-joking if I'd ever consider joining the reformed HOA, now that the old guard is gone. I just smile and shake my head. Not a chance. I lock the gate every night, not out of expectation, but out of respect for the boundary that held when everything else bent. Some evenings, I drive past the subdivision out of habit more than curiosity. The lawns are a little less uniform now. A porch here sports an unapproved blue door. Wildflowers spill over one curb where perfect sod once reigned. There's talk of dissolving the HOA, entirely letting people live as they choose. It's remarkable how one firm line held long enough can shift an entire landscape. One crisp morning before harvest, I found a small envelope tucked under the gate latch. No stamp, no address. Inside a single sheet in shaky handwriting. You probably don't remember me. I voted for Karen. I thought you were the problem. I was wrong. Thank you, T. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into the drawer beside the original deed, the one my grandfather signed, when this land was still wilder than it is now. Then I walked the field's boots sinking into earth that knew my weight and welcomed it. Life doesn't pause for victory speeches. It simply keeps growing through cracked soil, through storms, through seasons that turn whether we approve or not. Out here under a vast sky that answers to no committee, the land remains uneven alive, unapologetically real. Justice sometimes arrives wearing work boots and carrying bolt cutters' scars. And I still lock the gate, just in case. But mostly because it reminds me, freedom has hinges. And they swing both ways only when you choose to open them.